The content of this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional for any health concerns. Take care of yourself out there.
Welcome to Unravelling. This is a podcast that sees the world through the lens of mental health. I'm Mary Wilson, a journalist.
And I'm Kurt White, a social worker and psychotherapist. So, Mary, it's, International Peace Month. I don't know if you're celebrating or not, but I'm celebrating a little because it's a time when we can have a very unraveling episode of Unraveling, I think, where we can really sort of dig into some topics that get into this complicated, very rich intersection of the interpersonal and intrapersonal and the world that we live in.
In what are certainly not peaceful times, very polarizing times that we're living in now. So we're going to talk about group dynamics and explore how this impacts people's behaviors and global conflicts even.
And, I think these are things that a lot of people are very stressed out about now. Certainly as a therapist, I hear about it, but also among friends of mine and others, I think the state of the world and the violence that happens, whether or not people are affected by it, they might be tuning in or tuning out, but it's often affecting us in subtle ways, don't you think?
Yeah, especially when it seems like history repeats itself and these sort of conflicts happen time and time again.
Yeah, it harkens back to my old college courses, reading the fundamentals of philosophy. Is this just how we are as human beings? Are we basically just going to fight with one another forever, try to destroy? Is that the primary thing in our lives or not? And I think, shouldn't psychology and the mental health field have something to say about that? I mean, it's kind of interesting, right? We talk so much about, individual level problems, but what about these kinds of things that affect so many millions of people in large ways? I mean, shouldn't we have something to say about that too?
Yeah, you would think that what we can learn in a group therapy setting or any therapy setting could maybe be applied to whole civilizations.
That's right. And actually there are some people that have done some interesting work in this area. I encountered one such person through some lectures at the American Group Psychotherapy Association, Dr. Vamik Volkan, who's in his 90s but still writing books, and was briefly in touch with him, and he declined to come on the podcast, but suggested that his son, whom he recently wrote a book, Human Aggression, War, and Genocide, that his son, who's a psychologist in California, might be interested to talk with us.
And we took that opportunity.
We sure did. Dr. Kevin Volkan is a psychologist, writer, educator with decades of experience in clinical, corporate, and academic worlds. He's a professor of psychology at California State University at the Channel Islands. He holds 2 doctorate degrees in psychology, has worked for Harvard School of Public Health, has testified before the Senate, has written many books, including the one I just referenced, written with his father, who's really one of the pioneers of using psychological and psychoanalytic ideas to try to understand what's going on at the level of group identity and leadership in the world.
Okay, let's get into that interview.
Well, Dr. Kevin Volkan, thank you so much for joining me on Unravelling today. My hope is that we could talk a bit about some of the things you've done in your work. You've done a lot of different things, but especially, I think, around this intersection of psychology and large group identity and extreme conflict in the world, the subject of a recent book that you co-wrote with your father. And I'm curious, what got you interested in that sort of thing?
I've been interested in group psychology for a long time. Back in the day when I was in practice, I practiced group psychotherapy, and I very much enjoyed that and felt that it was kind of the psychotherapy for the people. It's expensive to go to psychotherapy. And I like group psychotherapy because anybody most people could afford to go to group psychotherapy. I'm very, very much interested, especially these days, in taking the insights we have from, the therapy hour and the therapy office and expanding those out to the world at large. And I'm obviously very influenced by my father in this, because he's been doing this for a while with conflict resolution stuff around the world and applying, his psychoanalytic knowledge to, how people interact with each other at a large group level. And that's very interesting to me.
I largely think of myself as a group therapist also. I guess I'm not, I'm doing a little bit less of that work clinically at the moment, but it's the primary thing that I teach and have done a lot of it over time. And so it's been interesting to me too. But sometimes I find that, like, my group therapist colleagues, they think about the group that they're in at the moment, and they're very good therapists. But they don't think as much about the group dynamics as I sometimes wish that folks would. Some do, some don't. And I think part of what's interesting to me about your work and your father's work is, certainly the large group focus, but also that sort of way that groups of all sizes affect and influence us, whether we're aware of it or not. That kind of side of group dynamics, that there's a thing being done to us.
Yeah. And I would agree with you. I think most group therapists don't think about the structure of the group, in as a whole, as opposed to just the people in the group working with them. The one thing that's interesting about my dad's work that I think is that really fascinates me is how large groups, but even smaller groups, you could have people who are relatively normal, neurotic personality in an organization, but you put them in a group together. And especially if the leader is showing some pathology, you will get dependency and fight or flight dynamics as opposed to pairing dynamics. And that's something we see in large groups. You get a large group together and everybody functions at borderline personality organization level, even maybe some groups, even psychotic personality organization level, really fragmented. And but you get people alone individually and you talk to them and, they're relatively together. And that's something that really fascinates me. And I want to look into that a little more in detail in the future.
There's something about large groups then, that is maybe intensely stressful and maybe disorganizing, that gets people to behave in very different ways than they might in a smaller group. Is that what you're saying for folks that are not clinicians?
Yeah, but large groups do have some dynamics that I don't necessarily think occur in smaller groups.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about those? What are some of those?
Yeah,
dynamics?
One thing that we see in large groups is transgenerational transmission of trauma. So you have parents in one group, large group, and they undergo a trauma of some kind, and then they transmit that to their children in a way where the children can sort of psychically digest it and do something with it, but that will influence the way they form a group. And there's also another, maybe possibly more pathological version of that, where the trauma is deposited in the children. And depositing versus transmission, the deposited trauma is something that the child is not able to psychically deal with, to psychically digest. And so it remains sort of fragmented, embedded in the child's mentality. And then you have a whole, if you think of a collective group of people who have this, then when they form a national group, they have to do something with that. And so a leader will come along, especially a narcissistic leader, who will then basically tap into that and get this group of people then to sort of project out the bad of the trauma onto an out group somewhere. And especially if you have a malignantly narcissistic leader, that projection will be accompanied by a lot of hostility, a lot of aggression. In other words, that narcissistic leader will get their grandiose self inflated by having the followers project out the aggression and also act out the aggression onto some out group people. And that probably is a lot of the mechanism that we see in a lot of, nation state, but even, large group conflicts, around the world right now. There's probably a lot of that going on.
Yeah, I kind of want to unpack that if I can. I'm on the one hand, right, that there's perhaps a cultural trauma, right? Something like, the Holocaust or something like that. Is that what you're talking about? That gets sort of metabolized internally, right? But then also passed down generationally. It gets remembered, a war or something like that.
It's something that the psychiatrist and psychoanalyst John Mack, who was at Harvard, I believe, he called it cultural amplifiers. And so these things, there's really two big versions of these: chosen traumas and chosen glories. So sometimes they can be chosen glories, things our culture did that were fantastic. And sometimes they are things that, traumas that the group experienced, like the Holocaust is a good example. And I have a student who, an Armenian student, did her dissertation on the Armenian Holocaust, and she actually used quantitative measures and was able to measure the transgenerational transmission of the trauma 3 generations out. And so, this is something we actually can measure, using various, measures of attachment and, object relations and things like that she used. And that would be an example of a chosen trauma that gets transmitted and becomes part of the culture, something that's remembered as a group and is something that the group, organizes around, right? And the traumas are very powerful. In fact, the chosen trauma is more powerful than the chosen glory.
Interesting. Yeah.
Unifying people. But then the leader can come along and use that trauma or that glory to unify them to some task that the leader wants to accomplish. It's a restorative task, a reparative task. That can be a good thing that happens, or it can be a negative thing, like, they got us, we need to get revenge. So remember that thing that happened to us. And I give an example sometime, a kind of a case history of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 and how that, the cultural amplifiers from that were, passed down and then reactivated in the 1990s, in the Bosnian War, conflict, in Bosnia, Serbo-Croatia, those kind of things. And so,
is that true that was talked about or on people's minds in some way?
It's in their unconscious. It's in their dreams. It's in their myths. It's in the stories that the kids are told. And so we can see this. And so anytime you see conflicts in the world where there's a tremendous amount of trauma, this is not a time limited thing. This is something that's going to be around for a very, very long time. And if you really want to sort of, maybe speculate beyond the data a little bit, but I think not too terribly so, you could look at any place on the planet that's been colonized at some point, and you can see the effects of the trauma even many, many generations out, in the culture of the people there. Colonization has this effect of creating chosen traumas. And perhaps for the people inflicting the colonization, they have chosen glories. The great thing, we went in, we civilized these people, blah, blah, blah. But one of the examples I give is like, United States landing a man on the moon. That is a chosen glory of American society. We put a man on the moon. Nobody else did that. We did it first. It's this fantastic achievement. And, we think of ourselves as Americans as the people who conquered space. We're the ones who did it. The Russians weren't able to do it. Chinese haven't done it yet. We did it first. And then all the technology that was an offshoot of the space program, we bask in that chosen glory. And it's something that can unify us together, right? Something unifies us together. And then you have something like when the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up, and then there's a chosen trauma that is related to the chosen glory of the moon landing, right? So they become kind of mixed together. We were unified at that moment, or you could think of 9/11, another chosen trauma in America. Those are the kind of things I'm talking about.
That's interesting. And the word chosen here, it's an interesting word because in a way there really isn't anyone doing the choosing, isn't it? It's a sort of collective action, maybe even an unconscious collective action.
Yeah, and I think what my dad is trying to get across with the word chosen is that a lot of times the leader will highlight that and focus on the chosen trauma or the glory, and then use it for their ends. Now, a reparative leader will use it to bring people together and do, good works. Even a narcissistic leader, but one who's reparative, will use it to bring people together in a constructive way. And then, somebody like a malignant narcissist will use it to in a very destructive way.
Or sometimes both at once, it might be, right? I mean, I think there's also examples of that.
Yeah, I think they can be mixed up to some degree. When you're collectively basking in your trauma, you get a sense of unification with the group members, and there's some pleasurable aspect to that. And likewise, if you're all basking in a chosen glory together, you're all together in this chosen glory, you also then, as a group, are reflecting on some sacrifice that had to be made for that glory. So, that's some ideas I'm playing with a little bit.
I like that. And maybe I'd like to just even explore, just because we're talking about it already, this idea of like individual and collective identity. And this is something that you guys write about in your book. And could you kind of distinguish those things? How are they alike? How are they different? I've always been sort of curious, how does the collective identity get into us even? I had a moment a number of years ago when I was like at an airport. I'd been abroad, but not in any, conflicted way. It was a vacation. And I was there with my wife and came back, and it was a smaller airport. So it was a less hectic sort of movement back through, immigration, naturalization services, and pull out your passports. It's a moment where they force you to feel like something. And the agent came in and said in a very, formal way, citizens of the United States of America, welcome home. And like we'd been to war or something. And it was very strange because my wife and I, who have ambivalent relationships about our government and things like that, we both teared up, and looked at each other like, what the hell is happening here? What's going on? Like it tapped a thing inside of us that we didn't even know was there, I think that happens a lot, and in a lot of, much more complicated ways than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I mean, about individual identity, and maybe the listeners know this or not, but our individual identity, and I'm very much my theoretical orientation is very object relations. So in a sense that I think of of the development of the infant, as the infant is developed, the first person you have a relationship with is a mothering person. And there's a great quote that I got from a poet that's in the book that, my mother is my first country. I'm paraphrasing. My mother is my first country, right? So, we get our identity develops in this relationship with the mothering person. And first we develop a sense of, emotionally feeling good and bad. We experience those things. And eventually we're able to start distinguishing ourselves from this mothering person, and have a sense of that person becomes more realistic. They're both good and bad, hopefully mostly good, and some bad. And then we're able to distinguish ourselves from that person. And then that's sort of maybe the beginning of, developing an identity. And then we internalize the image. And by image, I mean not just visual, but, the feeling states and the verbal and everything, the cultural markers from, the adults in our, the people around us, siblings, adults in our society. And then from that, we develop a sense of identity. And you probably know as well as I do in the psychoanalytic literature, identity is one of those things that is, the definitions can be a little squishy. Is it your ego? Is it your, if you're a Jungian, is it yourself with a big S? If you're a Freudian, is it the self with a little s? Is it your self-concept? If you're a Cohoosian,
the true or false self, for example. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We dance around all these things, but our identity is kind of like in there in all these things.
I like that a lot. And to what extent does the sort of large group identity develop in relationship to the other, to the one that isn't a part of the group?
Yeah. So my speculation on this is that it comes from our evolutionary past, that as primates, human primates, back in the day, that had survival value. In the group, there are hierarchies. There's a dominance hierarchies in the group. There are group leaders. There's jockeying for dominance in the group, all these things, but these all, had survival value. When we became humans, we have bigger brains, we have larger imaginal capacity. And so our ability to form groups, be in groups has expanded to these very large groups. Chimpanzees don't make nation states. Great apes don't make nation states.
No.
We human beings, we do. And of course, a lot of that has to do with language and our incredible, powerful symbolic ability that we can symbolize things. But the idea that we have our in-group and there's an out-group, typically, in primate groups, if there's an out-group, there's a kind of a calculation that goes on, a return on investment calculation. How strong is that group? Are they the same strength as us? If so, then maybe we better, we distrust them, but maybe we'll do some display aggression and they'll do some display aggression. And then we'll kind of get along and leave each other alone because, if I attack them, they're just as likely to kill me as I am to kill them, right? But then if there's a group outside and the perception is they're not as powerful, then what you see in the primates is then that group, they'll then get attacked, and their resources, typically, in primate groups, the females, will be available for mating after the infants are killed. And you see this in chimpanzee raids. The males will go in, they'll kill the other males, they'll kill the infants, and the females will go into estrus more quickly. And then, they'll mate with the invading males. We tend to call it collateral damage, and we just bomb, people who aren't combatants. And that's kind of how we as humans manifest that sort of primate trait. So even when we have large groups, we have the same sort of pattern with the other. And then, of course, again, because our bigger brains, more symbolic power, this return on investment calculation that we make becomes much more convoluted. And what you see that calculation's been made and there has been a huge mistake. For primates, it's not so convoluted. They can look and see how many are over there, okay. But for us, with our big brains, we bring all these kind of things, all our fantasies become involved in it. Our ideologies become involved in it. It becomes this huge thing. And, a great example of this is the Japanese, bombing Pearl Harbor and starting a war with the United States, that they could attack us and that we would back down, or we would do something they wanted to do, from their show of force. Huge miscalculation. And, no ape would have done that. No chimpanzee would have bombed Pearl Harbor. They would have said, no way, we're not going to bomb somebody's bigger and stronger than us because we know what will happen, right? But, given that at that time, the Japanese ideology, Japanese government was essentially a military dictatorship by that time. I mean, they had parliament and stuff, but essentially it was run by the military. And they fed their fantasies about who they were and their ability to project force. And that's what guided them to do this stuff. Again, chimpanzees don't do that. They don't have enough brain power for that, but humans, we do that. And so there's lots of times you'll see the mistakes are made. We tend to, I would speculate, we tend to make more mistakes with judging the other than, perhaps our primate relatives do.
It's interesting. You're in a way, you've painted a pretty dark picture in a way, but in a way where we're thinking about war and genocide and very dark things like that you have written about. But it sounds almost like we've inherited the sort of aggressive traits from our evolutionary history that haven't been done away with, but also there wasn't. We've carried them into the mass society that we live in. And now we're also using our big brains to do things that even they wouldn't have done. We're projecting our fantasies onto others in large scale ways that have maybe no relationship to reality, and then acting on them. Is that what you're saying?
It's actually more pessimistic and worse.
That's
because
not
only have big brains, we have these fantastic hands that allow us to make tools. And so we've used our big brains to make tools to make us more and more efficient killers. And if you look at the history of warfare over time, you'll see that we've become, much more efficient in killing. Now you can sit in the desert somewhere in the Western America in a bunker, press a button, and launch a drone missile specifically targeted at an individual or a group, halfway across the world. We've become very efficient killers. Our primate ancestors are very inefficient killers.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have big brains and tools that have become better and better and better at killing each other. And to the point now where we can annihilate the entire planet with nuclear weapons. So it is a very pessimistic, very dark picture. But I think if we don't face that picture, we try to bury our head in the sand and not deal with this, I think then things become worse. And I think if you look at international relations and you look at trying to do conflict resolution and that kind of thing, what you see typically out there is a rational actor model, where, if people just act rationally, if they're, they have the reason. Well, that's not the case. As we know, as psychotherapists, people behave from very irrational points of view. And the more we can we can shed some light on what that irrationality is and how it functions, the better we're able to take that into account when we have to deal with other people, especially a large group conflicts. Without being political, I can say we're seeing that kind of shift, in America right now, and in lots of parts of the world. We're seeing a shift in what people's perception of their governments and those kind of things going on really strongly. What's causing that at a collective level? What's the shift that pushed us over? And I think if we start applying psychoanalytic insights to this, we may be able to get some better idea into, why we collectively move in certain ways. And I think that's very important for the survival of the human race.
Yeah. And that would have something to do with both the ways that we are metabolizing or sometimes failing to metabolize our collective traumas, and the way that this can be exploited by leaders who may, especially leaders with certain kinds of personality traits and histories and gripes and grievances of their own, to sort of bring about certain kinds of things. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
The very famous Jungian analyst James Hillman wrote a book. We've had 50 years of psychotherapy and we're not getting better. Or he's very critical of the psychotherapy industry, he might say. But, I would maybe counter that and say, the problem is that we maybe don't have enough psychotherapy. Maybe psychotherapy needs to be more widely spread and not so symptom oriented, but more kind of learning to know yourself oriented. And, the predominant psychotherapy that we have is, CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, which is fine and does great job at what it's designed to do, which is to deal with symptoms and, get people sort of able to function. And that's really good. But we should also perhaps give some, credence and some attention to the kind of psychotherapy that really helps us, know who we are. If we know who we are as individuals and we're more aware of our emotional patterns as individuals, perhaps then when we get together in groups, we'll also carry that awareness into the collective. And then also maybe we need some kind of form of, psychotherapy like guidance for the collective. And, I think again, leaders, if I had my druthers, I was the king of the world, I would require, national leaders to have to go through psychotherapy. We require, if you want to be a policeman, I live near Los Angeles. If you want to go to Los Angeles and be a policeman, you're going to go to see the police psychologist. They're going to vet you. They're going to give you tests. They're going to make sure you're not going to go crazy. They vet you. And, we don't have that for our national leaders who have, in a way, responsibility for huge numbers of, the welfare of huge numbers of people. And we don't even think about that. What we tend to do is we tend to elect narcissistic individuals. And especially in some cases that can be good. That can be a reparative narcissist. They can do very good. In some cases, we get, more pathological narcissism. And I think that that's something that could be, we certainly have the capacity to recognize that as therapists. I mean, you could be, vetting a political candidate. You would be able to tell this guy's, maybe shouldn't be running for office. You'd be quite capable of doing that. We have the technology to do it. We just haven't manifested it. We haven't had the group collective wisdom to say, we are going to be more careful about who we're choosing as a leader.
And is there also a plea in there for us to interrogate our sort of large group identities a little bit more?
Yeah.
I mean, the way that, because isn't one of the dynamics of this that the large group identity can take over entirely in certain ways, right?
Yeah, I think if you had a population of people who were all had some, some, and I'm using therapy in a very loose way, but some sort of way of encourage them to reflect on themselves. What's the fancy new word? Mentalization. Where people had something that helped people increase their capacity for mentalization. I think the collective group mind would be very different. And I think people would be a lot more aware of what was going on collectively. And then maybe, if you're aware of it, then you can act accordingly. If you're unaware of it, you're just going to act blindly.
Yeah.
And I think, quite honestly, that's what we have now all around the world. I think we're acting blindly, and we repeat some of these primate aggressive patterns. But I don't think that's an absolute necessity. I think we have the capacity that we could change things.
How would we do that? How would we go about changing them? I mean, you've named some things, more psychotherapy, but I'm also curious what it would kind of involve in us. What it would look like.
I think I'm very biased on this because I am a professor. That's how I make my living. And I would say that I think education is really important here. I think we need to educate people about the importance of, a life examined, as Plato would say, that we don't want to live the unexamined life. And we need an education system that fosters curiosity, and especially curiosity about who we are and what we are, why we're doing here, instead of what we've sort of devolving into is an education system that's basically trying to create people to be cogs in a machine. Okay, you're going to get this kind of training that's going to train you for this job, and then you're going to go and do this kind of work until you die, and that's it. But you don't think about yourself. Don't think about the bigger picture things. And we started to lose that in education. And I would say, that's been the ideal of the liberal education. I'm using liberal not in the political sense, but in the education sense. That that not only are the sciences and technology important, but also the humanities. The things that the unique aspects about us that have to do with our humanity, which get a lot of short shrift. Especially at the university system, because humanities professors can't get grants, right? So, they get the short shrift, but I think we need to be paying attention to that. And I think also at the K through 12 level, we need to be paying attention to that as well. And, this is something perhaps where in the past, these kind of questions were answered with religion. So how do we look at the big questions? We could include religion in that, but how do we look at it also from a more philosophical, more humanistic point of view, and sort of increase our ability to to think about ourselves and to empathize with other people.
If there were one or two things that you would want everyone to know about large group psychology and how it affects us, what would those be?
I think the first thing is I would hearken back to Freud, civilization is discontents, and I would say that our civilization is a thin, sublimated veneer of our sexual and aggressive urges, and because it's very thin, it wears through very quickly, and we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of how fragile being civilized in a group is for human beings, and how easily that can be short-circuited, and civilized people can do really terrible things to others. And the second thing I would say is that I think it's important to be aware that, in a positive sense, that, that we have an immense power for cooperation. This is another reason why human beings are the dominant primate, animal on the planet. It's not just because we're aggressive toward outgroups, but it's also because we're able to cooperate with each other. And so how can we foster our ability to be cooperative, for a common goal at the expense of being aggressive to get what we want? There's a Buddhist idea about this. There's a very famous Buddhist writer, professor, Robert Thurman. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Yeah. No, I actually have. I've heard him speak and met him, actually, yeah.
He's a wonderful speaker. He's the father of Uma Thurman, the actress. And he writes very interesting about the Buddha's life history, that after the Buddha became enlightened, he went on and he gave his first sermon, and these monks and people got enlightened. But a lot of people don't know is before he gave his first official sermon, the Buddha's walking along. He's just become enlightened. He's walking along, and he sees some merchants, and they've got a cart, and it's stuck in the mud, and they're trying to get it out. And he goes up to him. And he's enlightened, gives them a mantra or something, and they say it. I'm paraphrasing here, and they're able to, now they're able to push the cart out. And the Buddha, right then and there, actually gives his first teaching to the merchants. And Thurman talks about this. The symbolism of that is very important, because you have especially in ancient India at that time, you had a bunch of different small nation states, city states, nation states, small, and they were all fighting each other. One wanted something from another. They'd raise an army and go and attack the other one, kill people and take what they want, and vice versa. That one would raise an army and go attack somebody else. And that's how people were interacting. And the symbolism of Buddha giving his first sermon to the merchants is that you don't need to go and attack, kill people. Instead, you can say, what does that group want? I'll empathize with them. What do they want? They want this. I have this over here. I have the thing that they want. They got something I want. Maybe we can make an exchange and trade. Maybe, having a more mercantile, transactional, financial relationship is a way that we can not just have to attack and kill each other like primates do, because primates don't do that. But human beings, we could do that. And the Buddha's sermon is a good example of, I think what Thurman is saying is that's why it was his first teaching. That's how important it is to promote peaceful exchange of goods and ideas and helping each other get what we want without violence.
I love that. it makes me think that there is a resilience in us after all, that there is something working towards civilization despite all of these aggressive impulses. I guess I'm a little heartened to remember that.
Yeah, me too. And I have to remind myself of that because sometimes I just feel so overwhelmed by the negative. But it's very important. And I mean, you as a therapist, I mean, when you are working with your clients and you see the ability to reflect on themselves growing in that person, that also is a very heartening thing. They realize you are producing, helping produce, or helping initiate or catalyze people becoming more self-aware. That's only going to be a good thing. More self-aware people would rather trade and exchange and cooperate to get what they want rather than go out and kill other people. I think, unless there's some kind of psychopath, very rare psychopath. But I think most people would rather not get what they want through violence.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. I think that fits with my experience. I think people are. I even think that so many people in the moment are just interested in engaging with psychotherapy. I think fundamentally that's an enterprise of wanting more self-knowledge.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Volkan, thank you so much for talking with me today. And it's been such a great pleasure. And I've really learned a lot. And I really highly recommend your book and your work. And I'd actually love to have you back on to talk about some of your other work that I've been looking into as I was preparing for today's talk at some point, if you'd be interested.
Oh, I'd be very happy to do that. And, if I can give myself a shameless plug, my dad and I also have another book out that we published, 2 years ago on, it's called How the Mind Works. We didn't come up with the title, but How the Mind Works in Cases and Concepts in Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy. And so some of the things we're talking about, the idea of sort of, explaining psychoanalytic ideas in sort of plain language, was kind of the impetus a little bit behind that book. And so I'll mention that one too, if any of the listeners want to actually learn more about psychoanalysis and learn some of the things that we were talking about, learn more deeply. And we kind of took the median, of Freudian psychoanalysis. We didn't include the Jungians and stuff in there. The Freudian psychoanalysis, the median, and just tried to explain things, that anybody could pick the book up and read it and understand some of these things. So shameless plug out there for that one too. And then of course, large human aggression, is out right now and it's available anywhere you can get a book. So
it is, yeah, and it's a very good read too. I will say that we will link to both of those in the show notes. And is there anything else you'd like to plug or to resources you'd like to point us in the direction of, or where people can find you?
I will say I might as well plug my other books. My dad and I also have a book on schizophrenia, and where we talk about doing psychotherapy with schizophrenia, which is something that's a little rare in North America. And then I have a book on a psychoanalytic book on drug addiction, which is available for free at freepsychotherapy.org. The people down in Washington, you can do digital version for free, and those are out there. And then, and I just encourage anybody who gets interested in this stuff to think about learning more about it. It's really fantastic stuff, and it's it's very intellectually satisfying to dig into this stuff. Really enjoy it.
Thank you again to Dr. Volkan for such a special, thoughtful interview about so many really big topics. And joining me again here is Mary. Hi, Mary.
Hi.
You know what this made me think of? I'm sorry to laugh a little, but it's sort of this sort of idea of things that are so large like this are sometimes almost unapproachable, right? And I think maybe this is one of the reasons why psychotherapy doesn't always get into trying to explain the social in this way. But as I was listening to Dr. Volkan, I was thinking of my nephew, who's now a young man and one of the sweetest people you'd ever meet. And when he was a young kid, we played with Matchbox cars. and he would ram them against each other and yell, "Tragedy! Major tragedy! Major tragedy!" We would do this together. And I thought the use of that word was always funny to me in a way, wasn't it, as a young person? But it sort of illustrated to me the way that the social is in us all the time. And you have a young son, a bit younger than he was when we played with Matchbox cars, but you probably know something about this. The way that we're all filled up with, very basic impulses on some level, right?
Yeah. That's not quite in his vocabulary yet, but he does surprise me by the things that he does with his toys.
And probably screams like a maniac when he wants something, right? Doesn't care if it's the middle of the night. His needs are his needs.
Primal instincts in us all.
Right? He wants to be fed, he wants to be fed. He's angry and unhappy, and you don't know why he's angry and unhappy, right? He says, that's the nature of a young person, right? You watch a young person. That's what development means, I think. That's sort of what it made me think of. Like, we have to, when he's talking about like psychoanalysis and stuff like that, some of it is just that we are people who have had to learn how to live together, and we've also had to do it with the stuff that we're made of, right? Which comes out of a part of us that just wants what it wants when it wants it, wants to scream and cry and throw ourselves on the floor. Now, being an adult means you don't get to do that in the same way very often anymore, right? It would be bad if we did that at work, for example, but there's probably a part of us, in all of us, that wants it, and maybe that also translates to this sort of social level, right? My country's the best one, and it wants to be on top, and it wants what it wants, and we're gonna do this and do that, and it wants to destroy yours and take your stuff, right? And there might be sort of a more primitive and a less primitive way to do that.
So we're all just toddlers at the root of it all, then.
I think we're struggling with maybe in a toddler nature, a primate nature. Parts of ourselves that are really, really complicated. In some ways, the question of why do we do terrible things to each other at the large level? It's a sort of almost an obvious answer, isn't it? It's like there's a part in all of us that would want to destroy something different, but there's also a part in all of us that could do something different with it. We could be curious about it, but we have to cultivate that at the individual level, but maybe at the collective level.
And how can we evolve at that collective level so that we don't have all of these terrible conflicts?
That's right. Well, it's a lot to think about, isn't it? Yeah.
And thank you so much to Dr. Volkan for giving us a little bit of insight, breaking down this big idea.
Yeah, and if people are interested in learning more, we're putting some really interesting resources in the show notes. Dr. Volkan is very prolific, and some of his work is free and accessible, and where he talks a lot more about many of these topics as well as other topics in psychoanalysis, and to some of his father's work, which was, we mentioned and he mentioned, really quite pioneering in this field and deserves to be mentioned.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being with us, and we'll see you next time.
Unravelling is brought to you by Brattleboro Retreat. Our producers at Charts and Leisure are Andrew Atkin, Hans Butow, and Jason Oberholzer.
And you can find us on social media by searching Brattleboro Retreat. Brattleboro Retreat is committed to exploring diverse perspectives on mental health. While we invite hosts and guests to share their insights, the views expressed are their own and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of the hospital or its staff.